Well, kia ora, Tata. Welcome back to the Māra, or to the conversation about the Māra. So, where shall we start? I was thinking this is now getting towards the end of our month of November, so we should be, in theory, we should be planted. Our Māra should be in the ground at least by early December, because we now need time for the plants of this season. So it's not all the plants, it's the ones for this season, to actually settle and establish before that the hot sort of summer period kicks in. So right now we're in between the full moon and the new moon. So this is Kurikuri Tūroa is the name for tonight or for this evening. So this is the start of the best planting period for this month. So for the next 7 days, it's an ideal time to be in the Māra, and to be in the Māra not in the hottest time of the day, but in the morning and in the evening. So this is the time to finish those jobs in the Māra and to get it, those tasks that are around establishing the crop. The other tasks that sit with crops that are already up, looking after themselves, they can be held over a little bit later if we run out of time. So if you haven't already planted your crops, I guess now's the time to put that into your schedule. For the kumara, we still have, I'm in the Manawatu, so it's not the first part of the country to plant the summer crops. So we're still planting our kumara. We'll do that for the next week, probably 10 days at least, to get them in before the weather changes, as I mentioned. So for your kumara, if you're growing your own tipu, then to take them off the I call it a pārekereke, but the tāpapa, the bed for growing your tipu, is to take them off at least a day ahead of planting. Don't pull them the same day as when you want to put them into the field. Pull them a day ahead. You need to condition them, and the old way to condition them is to have a bucket or a container of slush, of mud and water, and to hold those tipu in that slush overnight. It conditions the roots that have been pulled off the tāpapa, and it allows them to become stronger plants. Now, the kōrero from the old people is that if the kumara are not planted within the next 7 days, then you'll have small, your crop will be probably plentiful, but they'll be small kumara. They won't be large ones. So if you're looking for the family size kumara, then now's the time to get them into the ground. The other thing is that as fast as you plant your crop, the weeds settle in and they become to establish on the Māra as well. So your job is to ensure that your crop is the dominant plants in the system. So you'll never get rid of all of the weeds, and you probably don't want to, because they do look after the soil. They do shade the soil from losing all of its moisture in the sun. They do, if you cut them down and use them as a mulch, they do feed the soil as well. So you don't necessarily want to pull them all out, but you do want your crop to be the main plant in the system. So if you're growing corn, for example, or kāinga, the old corn, you have to ensure that your corn can outgrow those weeds around it. And it's not easy, because most of the weeds are faster growing, certainly in height. That's why they're weeds, because they have the ability to establish really, really quickly and to take over the space. The bigger the weeds are, the more they take out of your system. They take the light, they take the moisture, they take the kai from the soil. So the more that they make it harder for your plants to grow. For those of you that have grown corn, and I know this is the end of the planting season, if you live in some of the northern areas, and including Gisborne, you might even be harvesting some corn very shortly, because you're coming into the period where the first planting is ready for harvest, certainly for the factories. So, but if you're planting the corn, you're looking for an even strike. So you want all of that corn to be germinated and all coming up in the same 1 or 2 days, so that you see the whole row coming up rather than just 1 or 2, because they need to mature at the same time so that they can support each other in pollination and ensuring that the cob settles those kernels. So the rules around growing corn, the kānga, are that you need a minimum of 3 rows. You need preferably 4 or 5. If you understand the life cycle of the corn, they produce the pollen when the tassels come afterwards, but the pollen flies, so it's pollinated by air. The pollen flies in the air and it's picked up by the silks of the emerging cob, and those silks pollinate each kernel, so the pollen has to fly in the air. And if you only have a single row of corn, the pollen flies off. So if you have multiple rows of corn, the pollen will stay in amongst it and pollinate those cobs. So when you get cobs that are half empty, that's because the pollen hasn't been able to do its job when it was coming through. So plant them out. Use the corn as a windbreak in some places, because it's the more rows you plant, the more that it becomes able to slow the wind down in your garden. And one of the issues with the wind, if you live down in Canterbury, for example, you'll well know that the wind dries out the soil. The wind dries out not just the soil, but dries out your crops. It's constantly taking the moisture off the plants, and it's constantly taking the moisture from the top layers of the soil. So you want to protect your crops from the constant wind, from the nor'easter if it's down south, or from the where we are here, the southwest of that sort of wind. So you can use the corn as a temporary windbreak. There are other crops that are not concerned with the wind so much, and that might be your komo or your the pumpkins and those ground cover type crops. How many of you are growing watermelon? Is another favorite crop for the summer. And if you're growing, I know if you're growing in the Hawke's Bay, for example, they'll plant watermelons so that they can harvest them at Christmas time, on that week of Christmas for your first harvest. The longer you can let them in the ground with the sun on them, the better flavour, because it's the heat that encourages that flavour production in the watermelon. On the west coast, or even Taranaki and all of that, the watermelon are a later crop in the season, so it might be the end of January, might be February by the time you harvest. But if you are growing them, keep the seed from the ones that do best in your region. So watermelon seed keeps very well if you want to think about watermelon for next year. So keep the seed, or target keeping seed from the watermelon that you've grown in your area, because you know it grows well in your conditions. There are quite a lot of different varieties out there, and they will have different preferences. So here we are. It's November. For the best part, our Māra is in. We won't have 100% cover in the Māra, because we always want some of the ground to be resting, because we want to think about crops in the next few months. We want that ground to have a rest. We also want to have a rotation of some of the summer crops, the lettuces and those tomatoes and those crops that constantly provide for the summer meals. So not everything is all planted at the same time. Lettuces in most parts of the country in the summer would be at the very most 3 months in the garden, whereas in the winter it might be 4 months, but 3 months. So you can stagger what you plant so that you've got a certain number planted each week, and they become the available food for the table in 3 months' time. You know that they're also harvesting the first of the potatoes, the first of the riwai, in this part of the country and some other parts of the country, because the short season crops are planted directly after the winter and they're ready for harvest prior to Christmas. So we're working towards the spring planting being harvested for use. And those early crops are generally not harvested for storage, they're harvested to be eaten straight away. So the crops that we want to harvest for storage will come at the end of the summer, and they will be harvested going into the autumn period, because they have a bit of maturity and they're better suited to that longer term storage. Right, so what do we do to, I know last time we talked about some of the issues that will come through the pests and the diseases and the weeds. Well, what can we do to keep the Māra looking after itself in many ways? And really we want to do an integrated program, so not just think of pests and nothing else, not just think of weeds and nothing else, sorry, but look at the garden, look at the Māra as an integrated picture and say, what can we plant here? You can, for example, plant garlic or chives or spring onions around crops like your tomatoes, and that will keep some of the pests from settling in, because they don't like the conditions that comes out of that, the smell that comes from those onions doesn't allow them to come in. So you can do that, support planting around your crops. But you should also look at how you can harvest, or how you can, establish your crops so that you can use green mulch, maybe clippings from your garden on the taiwa patch to help hold back the weeds, but also feed the soil. Some of the old people, when they planted their taiwa, their potatoes, they would line the trench with green clippings from the lawn, because those green clippings would make some fast available some nitrogen for their new crop. Others will use the clippings as a mulch to keep some warmth on the soil during this period, during the spring, but also to stop the soil from drying out too fast. One of the things you need to do for taiwa is ensure that the soil is well mounded around those plants, because if the soil is loose or cracked, then the insects will find their way in and start eating their way into those young taiwa, young potatoes, simply because they are easy to access for food. And of course, young plants have the better digestion for most of those pests. The other thing is to encourage the good bugs into the garden. So don't be shy to leave a patch of long grass along the fence line or something like that encourages mixed biology around the Māra, because it brings in the good as well as the not so good. The good things like ladybirds, things like lacewings, the insects that thrive in the garden, but they also thrive on the biology that settles with our garden. The more you have a mixed planting, the more you have less chance of a major sort of pest problem, because most pests are crop specific, and if you have a mixed garden, there's not a lot of kai for them to become a large population. So look at your mixed planting, look at ensuring that you have a rotation. So as I mentioned, some part of the garden will be not planted for this time of the year, and as you move out of the early planting, you might move into that fresh planting, but try not to take the same crops over and over again onto the same plot, because that encourages the pests or the diseases that might have come while those crops are there to carry over into the next cycle, So try and rotate your crops. Try and go from a patch of the Māra that had root crops to replace it with crops that are leafy crops, or to replace it with the corn, the grassy type crops like the onions and the corn. So try and do that rotation and ensure the garden has some variety of activity around it. And the other key point coming into the summer is to have your availability for water when you need it for this crop. You know that if you're growing taiwa, the first 2/3 of their life cycle is about establishing themselves as a plant. So getting enough leaves up to work, to take advantage of the light and the sun, the heat and the moisture, and to use that as an engine to get the plant up and working well. And then when the time is right, they say to themselves, now's the time to show our maturity, so they flower. and that flower indicates the change from being a young juvenile plant to being a mature plant. What follows flowering is that they stop trying to grow bigger and bigger and bigger, and they look to take advantage of their maturity to then start to store kai for the next season in their roots, and that becomes the new potato, the new taiwa. So they move from growing top growth, leaves and everything else, to putting their storage into the roots. That's the time where they need to have the most access to the kai in the soil. So when you're fertilizing these crops, if you're giving them kai, you need to give them kai early in their season to ensure that they've got access to it when they start to mature and when they start to develop the taiwa, and the same applies to the kumara. The advantage, or the role, sorry, of water is that when you then have the established potato on the roots or the kumara on the roots, then the water is how you size it up in many ways. So a really long, dry summer won't help in getting a bulk sort of crop, because they need water to bulk up, to be able to show their mass. So you need, towards the end of their period, you need to be applying irrigation if you've got access to it, to help the plants do their work, but also to help bulk up those plants and get a better sized crop out of it. So that means, or from my point of view, before the summer kicks in, before we move into that period of raumati, is to know where the water comes from, to know we've got access to the water at the right time of the season, and that we can apply it at the right time of the day. You never irrigate or water your crops in the middle of the day, because you're just setting it up for those plants to be burnt, for the water to take on the heat of the sun, and the water that sits on the leaves then basically cooks those leaves. So you always water early morning or in the evening. You know that a plant never actually stops working. They accumulate heat and energy during the day, and during the evening what's been accumulated carries on working, so the plant keeps on doing its internal job. Even though the sun may have gone down, the plant still has the energy stored to keep on working. So the water at the end of the day is still used by the plant, and in fact there's more benefit in how the plant builds itself by getting that water at that time of the day. If you water first thing in the morning, then it has a period of relaxed, sort of by that time it has run out of energy a little bit and it's waiting for the sun to come up. So that water tends to make a very firm, strong plant, and some of it will be lost once the sun comes up to respiration and sort of the loss of water through dehydration. So water, the best time is the end of the day, and but if you don't get that opportunity, then in the morning is also a useful period to water. For those of you that are in very dry climates, then you'll have to start watering much earlier in the season, and you'll have to look at understanding how to use mulches to their best effect to keep that moisture that doesn't go into the plant, that goes into the soil, to keep it in the soil and keep it working. Mulches can be all sorts of things. You can use straw, you can use a green cover mulch, so the grass clippings on the smaller garden. Some people, strawberries are an example, that use a plastic mulch for the plants to grow over, but they have straw just to keep the fruit clean. It can be any number of things, mulches. Their task is to keep the weeds down, provide the right environment for the plant, so the temperature at ground level, the access of water. But if you use a solid mulch, so say like a plastic mulch, you've got to recognise that the water won't get through that plastic into the soil around the plant. So you're compromising their access to water, and you may need to apply the water manually if that's one of your choices. So have a look at mulching, have a look at what you need for the irrigation coming for the rest of the season, and understand the time or the life cycle of those plants as to when you're going to get the best response for how you look after them. What you don't want to do is have a garden that needs you out working 6 or 8 hours a day to keep that garden in the right condition. That's too much. The garden in the right environment should look after itself, and you have oversight. You keep an eye on what's going on. You check that garden every day or every second day to see for the signs of pests or diseases. The example for the moment for ours is that the rabbits have got new, young rabbits coming through, and they are visiting. We don't see them, but they're coming through at night time to eat on some of the green vegetables. Ordinarily, those rabbits will be knocked out by now, but there's obviously still a few around. So some things you don't see what it is that comes and feeds on your garden, but you'll certainly see the damage that they do. For other crops, depending where you live, possums are very they like young growth. They particularly like some citrus possums, so they'll come and eat your grapefruit or oranges, as an example, in preference to lemons. But recognize the damage and then look to how you respond, how you deal with the impact on your garden. If you see white butterflies are a sign of the problem. They're not the problem themselves, it's the caterpillars, that is their juvenile generation, that becomes the problem. And white butterflies will generally, a lot of what they do is a cosmetic problem on your brassicas and some of the other crops, but they also, they become a problem if their population gets too high. So what do you do if white butterflies are in your garden? If it's only 1 or 2, then hope that that's all it is, and you can use something like Dairis dust to ensure they don't feed on your plants. But if it becomes a big problem and the caterpillars are everywhere in your garden, then you look to use an appropriate caterpillar or pesticide to ensure you can knock out that generation. Because like all pests, there are 3 stages to their life cycle: the eggs, the juvenile, and the adult. And you knock out the caterpillars at one stage, the eggs that are there will become the next family of caterpillars next week. So you haven't fixed the problem. You have to go back next week and give it another management. And if you haven't knocked out the adults, they'll lay some more eggs, and you've got the problem still comes back 2 weeks later. So just knocking out one lot of caterpillars doesn't solve the problem, because there's 3 life stages to that pest. That also applies to most of your pests, your diseases, but in the midsummer, we don't have so much disease problem because the conditions for disease are not ideal. Most diseases, certainly the fungal diseases, like moisture in the air. And we measure the moisture in the air through relative humidity, which means how much of the air is saturated with moisture. And in the midsummer, in New Zealand conditions, the air tends to be very dry. So we don't have high fungal problems, but we do. Our late summer and early autumn are particularly an issue for some of the diseases. We can do 2 things with those things. One is that we harvest our crops before the diseases come in and become a problem. The second is we practice good hygiene on the Māra, so we take away the waste from our crops, or we bury it, or we compost it, so that it doesn't become a home for the fungus for the next cycle. We do an early harvest if we do see the problem coming in. So if we're looking at potatoes, for example, and late blight, as everyone knows, can destroy your whole crop in a very quick period of time. And late blight has a very specific weather conditions, 23 degrees Celsius and about 90% humidity. And as soon as it gets here, it just populates very, very quickly, and you don't get the chance to deal with it. So in a good garden, you would protect from late blight. You might plant early so that your crop's out early, or you might at a certain stage take the tops off your potatoes so that the blight doesn't get to settle on the top growth, and you let the potatoes store naturally in the ground. Just those sorts of approaches to your Māra. Overall, now the one other crop that we'll just talk about before we come to an end is the one that everyone tries to grow and most do very well, are tomatoes. And there's a couple of points about the tomatoes. Now, a good tomato plant should last several months, if not 12 months, in the right place if it's protected from the cold. Those that are grown in glass houses, some of the commercial crops might last even up to 2 years, but they should last a reasonable length of time. And tomatoes are grown as a salad crop. They're related to the potatoes, they're related to the peppers, the capsicums, eggplants, aubergine. They're all the same family of plants, so the pests and diseases that may come into those crops, the potatoes and the peppers, may also come into the tomatoes. If you get tomatoes, for example, that have a black spot at the blossom end, a flat sort of black end, it's called blossom end rot, and it's a lack of calcium in the plant, because the calcium is what makes the fruit strong. The same issue will apply to peppers, to capsicums, that you may see the end of the pepper being flat and blackened, and it's a lack of calcium in the plant. So they all have the same problem, but your tomatoes, if you plant, you should really have them in the ground in the last couple of weeks. You can aim to have fresh tomatoes by Christmas and continuously from that period onwards. But they need feeding. Because of all of that fruit that they produce, and all of that fruit is taken off to be consumed, it takes kai for the plant to produce that fruit. So you need to ensure that your tomatoes are regularly fed, inside or outside, so that they can continue to have strong flowers which produce good fruit, which you can then take into the table and enjoy. Your particular favorite varieties of tomatoes, you can keep some seed to save up for the next season. So keep one fruit, possibly two fruit, and we will put a bit of information online about how that seed is processed so that you can store it for the next season. You can still eat the skin, the fleshy part of the tomato, but you can keep the pulp with the seed, so that you can save some seed for the next season. So when you get a good variety, one that you particularly like, keep one of those fruit for seed, and then put that seed away for the next season. I think that's enough to get you busy for the next few months for your Māra. The main points probably to remember is that it is coming into the dry season, long days, so there's quite a big effect on the plants because they're long periods of sunlight and heat, which requires those plants to take up moisture to look after themselves and to be able to keep working as they should. So make sure they've got access to water, make sure that there's kai in the ground or there's kai in the pots that you are growing those plants in, and if necessary, put some protection up, especially from the wind, so you don't damage them. You can't, for example, grow good corn if it's all flat. So make sure you plant it in such a way that you protect those plants from damage, and basically say your karakias and enjoy your time in the Māra and your observation of the Māra, and it will look after you come the harvest period. So me te kia tātou.